Daniel, would you tell me about Timshel Permaculture and the Ravinia Institute? How are they different? What are they? What are they, and how did they come to be?
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you today, Jesse. So Timshel Permaculture, we're a regenerative and holistically managed farm here in Nelson County, Virginia. We're growing nutrient-dense and phytochemically rich foods, healthy soil, and biodiversity. On our land base using cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, chickens, ducks, turkeys, veggie production, food forests, and orchards to grow soil and to produce healthy food in the process. The actual farm is located in the Piedmont of Virginia in what we understand to be the temperate broadleaf mix oak biome. And we farm according to that ecosystem and the processes therein. And if you go to our site at timshelpermaculture.com, in that main banner section, you'll see a wonderful picture of a cow, but you'll see the words grass-fed is an understatement. That tagline is how we've decided to brand Timshel's online presence, but it really describes a lot of how we farm. Just simply putting cattle on grass and moving them and claiming virtue of rotational grazing as if rotating your cows was a virtue is seriously an understatement. We're trying to, as a farmed ecosystem, rewild and regenerate the story of ecosystem succession, of diversity, of resilience by placing animals in natural environments and allowing their nature to act naturally. I mean, that's simplistic, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. And we can talk more about the farm and our philosophy and how that impacts our practices later if necessary. But to answer your question, on top of Timshel is the Rabinia Institute, which is an educational center with the mission really to give others what nature has given us. It was founded in 2019 as the educational and consulting center of Timshel Permaculture. In our general mission, if I have to have one that's bigger than what I said already, it's to advocate, educate, and demonstrate the abundance, the joy, the peace, and the power, the regenerative power of holistically managed, but also well-designed living system. Um, I should make a note that the Robinia is a hub candidate of the Savory Institute and will be a full hub later this year. And we work closely with the Savory team and other organizations and institutes to throw courses online and in person, information-based webinars, pump out publications, and we're working on some book projects. And a lot of our time is focused off the farm in the consultation side, where we do everything from help suburb-based landowners convert their lawn into highly productive and more permaculture-based ecosystems. And at the same time, larger sort of either farms or organizations that own, hundreds, if not thousands of acres, transition their commercial degenerative farm into a highly profitable and regenerative enterprise for themselves, their families, their own farm business, but also the community, the wildlife, the soil, and their local food shed. And so that's the Rabinia Institute. I would say if I had to note a difference, one difference between Timshel Permaculture and the Rabinia Institute is Timshel's mission is to regenerate the soil and provide good food for our family and community, whereas Rabinia's mission is to help others do the same, in their own context, their own region, and in their own ways.
And how long ago did you start Timshel? I believe that came first. Am I right?
It did, yeah. So Timshel, as a brand on a particular land base, started in 2017. And so we've only been here for about 3 years.
So when did you first start farming?
We first started farming, um, it's a good question.
Yeah, did you grow up farming?
No. So I grew up on 30 acres. It definitely was not a farm. We did have a little garden, and every now and again we would get some, backyard chickens. We spent a lot of time outside, but in no way, shape, or form did I understand, the practices of, what we understand farming to be. So, cattle management and the like. We were very active outside. I have three other siblings, and we were all homeschooled for most of our lives. And I remember, as part of our homeschooling curriculum, was outdoor time. I mean, like that was part of our curriculum. And at the end of the day, if we didn't spend enough time outdoors, we didn't get our school day done. And so my time was heavily invested outside, and my interest in farming as a thing, as an actual spend of human time, really began, or maybe was really fostered, or fermented at a friend's farm, an actual farm. Growing up, um, there was a family really close to us who lived about 3 hours south, 2.5 hours south of where we grew up, just south of Cleveland, Ohio. They farmed, they owned land, I should say, in southern Ohio. Um, and every summer we would go down there for a week and just spend time on their farm, and ride horses, and do things like that. And everybody always laughs. This is a family story, but whenever I left the farm, that farm, I would always cry all the way home, and I mean that. Like, I would just shed tears, just complete weeping that we were leaving. I just felt so connected to that place, and even from a young age, like really freaking young age, um, I was just drawn to it. I was connected to it, and when we left and we drove back home, I just lost it.
Well, can you describe a little bit more about what you felt you were gaining or losing by being that in touch with
Mm.
that place?
That's a really good question. My wife Morgan and I, we talk about that, both of us, and maybe this is one of the reasons we were drawn to each other. We have a very strong connection to place. I think it was the feeling of complete naturalness, the limited expanse and beauty of the natural environment just captivated me entirely. On that farm, on those acres, with those people, um, my soul just, it felt home. I think that the point here, is, some things call us, and from an early age, I was called to, you know nature, as a thing, as a thing to partner with, but also a thing to enjoy, and it has always given me pleasure.
Well, you didn't start out career-wise in farming.
No, no, I didn't. So when I think this is a time for a story, and it's somewhat of a decently long story, and there's some complexity that I'm going to provide, and some complexity that I'm not going to provide. Um, but I'll tell the story anyways. So yeah, exactly right. So we were all homeschooled growing up. My father is a serial entrepreneur, and most notably, was a company he started when I was very young, which is a tech company. So I grew up in the world of tech, and that also impacted me. I like math. I like these sort of things, and I was heavily influenced by all that. Um, and when I went to college, that's what I studied. I was a mathematics and computer science major. I also majored in history, but that was more of a passion project. Computer science and math is what I thought I was going to go into.
Did you feel as though going into math and science was a safer path, the logical path, whereas your passion was in farming?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Um, and I think, to do this question justice, we have to take the answer all the way back to the beginning. Growing up, I was highly athletic, and participated greatly in team sports. My father played high school and college football, and I wanted to do the same, and I added in wrestling as well, something he dabbled in. But when it came down to it, I wrestled and played football with some of the greats. I have friends that are Super Bowl champions. Some folks that I wrestled with, on our national championship and state championship teams, went on to full ride scholarships at Ohio State, wrestling in the NCAA finals, etc. The point is, athletics really built my life, and even before technology impacted me, athletics seriously impacted my life, and what I've visioned my future to be. This all changed my senior year in high school, however. The first day of 2 days, it was August 2nd. We're jogging around the field to warm up. It's the second practice, 2 days in football. High school football means you have a practice, you break, and then you have another practice, two practices a day. That's what that means. It was the second practice. It started the second practice. We were warming up around the field. We were all joking and giggling, um, and I fell over, and I mean that. I literally fell onto the ground with immense pain in both of my hips. I finished, I got up and I limped around, kind of not really understanding what happened. It felt like I just got hit by a truck in the hips, when I was just jogging. And we went through the stretching routine, and about 5-10 minutes later, I just raised my hand and just got out. I just went to the trainer there at the practice facility, and I just, I couldn't go through the practice anymore. Go through for the season. At first, it was diagnosed as just a hip flexor strain, meaning that the hip flexor in my hip more or less just strained and was inflamed. And so we treated it that way. And throughout the rest of the football season, I wouldn't practice all week. I would just sit in the trainer or go to physical therapy, ice stretch, ice stretch, ice stretch. Friday night would come. I would play in the game. I would be so in pain after the game that they would cart me off the field back to the trainers. And then I would rest for the rest of that next week. Friday night would come, and we would repeat that cycle. But as you can imagine, this cycle was debilitating from an emotional and physical perspective. And after the season, I found it difficult to even walk without immense pain. And that difficulty really produced problematic results when it came down to athletic scholarships. You know, I laugh about it now, but there's a catch. With Division 1 and 2 scholarships, in that in order to accept them, you have to you have to be able to walk, let alone run, let alone play at the level they're expecting you to play at. And I couldn't do any of those things, and so I didn't. I didn't. I all Division 1 scholarships were removed, Division 2 scholarships were removed. It was an emotionally debilitating time in my life. We learned that I had not sprained my hips, but they were actually broken, and they were broken genetically. Well, anyways, after going through 2 years worth of surgeries and crazy things, and we traveled all around the country working with specialists, and my hips were removed and put back on, and all sorts of crazy medical stuff. I finally was able to walk. I've never really since sprinted. I've not really done any athletic activity, outside of just normal farming behavior since that time. But I was fixed enough. I'm fixed enough. But what followed those surgeries and that emotional depression, which I now understand to be depression, um, was intense illness. And when I say intense illness, about a month or about a year and a half after the last hip, and also had shoulder surgeries and everything else, it was all over my body. But after about a year and a half after all of that, I gained a bunch of weight, and I lost a bunch of weight. There would be periods of time, a month or two, where I would lose 80 to 100 pounds in that period and just totally waste away. And I remember sitting on the back porch at the moment in this story. I weighed less than I did in seventh grade when I wrestled. And in seventh grade, I cut 30 pounds, meaning I lost 30 pounds in order to wrestle at that weight. Well, anyways, I'm sitting in the back porch of my family's home and my childhood home, and I'm reading a book. And my mom comes out of the back porch, and she's seemingly emotional, not in tears, but you can definitely see there's emotion on her face. And she says, "Daniel," and she's been with me throughout this whole process. And she looks at me and she says, "Daniel, we've tried everything. We've tried surgeries, we've tried chiropractic care, we've tried, absolutely everything." I remember I laid on tables in these really weird operating rooms where they stuck massive needles into my body with injections and everything else, and they moved the needles around with cameras on the needles just to get some better. I mean, we just did everything you possibly could imagine. Um, and and so she says, we've tried everything, but there's only one thing we haven't tried. And she says, "We haven't tried chickens." And I kid you not, that's what she says, and I didn't understand what she meant, and so, obviously I asked, and she said, "Daniel, we've traveled all over the country. We've tried every sort of Eastern and Western medical practice that we could, but the only thing we haven't tried is raising our own food and being connected to our own place." And I said, "Okay, let's try it." I'm in a position of vegetation. I'm not going to discount any option for healing, and so that's what we did. Without asking Morgan, we just went onto Murray McMurray's website, bought 100 black Australorp chickens, and they came the next week. I didn't know anything about farming. I didn't really even know that I was stepping into a career path of a farmer. We were looking for healing, and we were looking for connection, really partnership, and that we defined that as the day we started farming, and we never really looked back. Or I don't believe that those 100 chickens did anything for my medical health scientifically, but just getting my hands dirty, and getting back to the land, and seeing purpose in partnering with other living forms, it was healing. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about my depression or my spiraling emotions of my past, and not being wanted as an athlete anymore. The pain of the surgeries, the gaining of the weight, the losing of the weight, and all the pain that followed. But the chickens did it for us, and we soon started raising more chickens, and we expanded our garden, and then I started working at, or interning, volunteering at local farms around us that were beef and sheep farms. And I soon realized that I wasn't going to be a career path in the tech field, that I was really finding not just health but peace in the world of connection, of partnership, but of farming. Um, and and this is a fine transition when Morgan and I immediately started thinking about brand, and forming our own farm, and seeing what a future looks like, for us in that. And it wasn't a good idea, but it was the idea at the time, and it's very meaningful. But we first named our farm. It wasn't Timshel. It was Shielhanta Balia, which is an ancient Irish phrase, that means the place of peace that I call my home. And in its own linguistics, what it really means is not a physical place, but it's a piece of a place that could be entirely emotional, that you feel at home. And that place of peace was connection, but it was health. It was the first health that I'd witnessed in many years. The point is, I found peace, I found connection to place, and I found supreme abundance when we started focusing on not just our place, but the partnership with the life therein.
So how's your health today?
And that's the question, right? Did it work? And perhaps a simple answer here is really what is needed. And I'm proud, and very blessed to say that yes, this absolutely worked. I do have some physical mobility issues in my hips that I don't think we'll ever get over. But from a health, from a vitality, from a lack of fatigue and just supreme energy, and even from a balance, hormone, stress, a mental perspective, I'm better today than I've really ever been.
But it wasn't just the physical pain. Yeah, it wasn't just the physical pain though. You had to. This was a moment of redefining yourself entirely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. It truly was a moment of definition. I think that moment was spurred on by the hope that was instilled initially, in my youth, among those natural environments that we spoke about. I don't think I thought, well, this is just another doctor's appointment. I don't think I saw this that way. Um, and I think once you've been pushed down to the bottom, to the very bottom, I mean, like, you're under the muck of the pond. You're at the very bottom of what you believe existence could be. It's a fine place to get to. And I say that with the full understanding that I've been there, and that folks listening to this might also be there or approaching that area. But there's nowhere to go but up. And that's a phrase we've heard, but countless times in movies, books, speeches, whatever. And I use it because it's true. The only thing that was left for me to do was to stop vegetating, right? It was to get out of the chair and try something that seemed very natural and very peaceful, which was simply just partnering with, my local ecology, which was the backyard, and the tools in which I could do that was with chickens. Now, how I did that was is a different conversation. My mom and my wife were heavily involved, and then slowly, as I got more, it was just more of my wife and I. But um, it took a total redefinition. I bought and borrowed every agriculture book you could possibly imagine, and I read them all because I didn't know what I didn't know, and that petrified me. And I wanted to reduce the risk. I mean, I'm a computer science and math major who's applying for tech jobs in Boston, for instance, and now I'm moving chickens in the backyard, and thinking about a future. And so, you know, it took a total redefinition of my life, but it wasn't daunting. And I think that's the beauty of my position, but also working with nature. And what I said in the very beginning of this concerning the Rabinia Institute and believing that a farm is not a land base that's large that produces cattle and sheep, but just a place of abundance in which you can partner with to produce greater abundance. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to partner with a place that was already abundant, but produce greater abundance, peace, and health through that collaboration, through that symbiosis, through that partnership. And that is what I believe healed me. Now, I say that, and let me break off into some science. We also at that time took an interest in health, in active health, and and we believe there's passive health and active health. Passive health, and both have a place. Don't let me say that they don't. But passive health is going to the doctor and saying, okay, I have these pains. What's wrong? That you are passive in that presentation, in that acquirement of health. Active health is entirely different. Active health is when you believe that there's things that you can do to heal yourself. Right? It's very simple. Eating healthier, having less stress, sleeping more often, meditating, practicing yoga, finding community, partnering with that community, right? All of these things are versions of active health. It was at this moment when we actually started to consider raising chickens in our backyard that health for us turned from passive to active, from seeking to partnership. And we started to see the role that food played in the environment in which produced our food into my life, into my health. And the first way we attack this is often unbelievable to folks, and it's what we did, and it's what we needed to do. And like I said, I was below the muck, and I needed to lift my head, and so that's what we did. For about 2 years, Morgan and I, 30 minutes before a meal, during the meal, 30 right after the meal, and 30 minutes after the meal. So document 4 different times, all around the act of eating, how I felt emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And then we would document after the meal all the ingredients in the meal. And so after a period of time, we created a massive data set based off of emotions, how we felt spiritually, and the physical feelings around eating. And we started to isolate variables, just as a scientist would isolate variables in a lab. That's what we were doing via this journaling, intense journaling. And we started to see that spiritually, I would get depressed or, feel disconnected or feel very dark when I ate ketchup. And then we would peel back the ingredients of ketchup and we would realize that, X was in ketchup. But also, I had the same emotion when I had, whatever. And we slowly started to isolate food variables in my life that caused negative emotions, negative feelings physically, and negative spiritual feelings around, after I consumed those foods. And we slowly started an elimination diet. And I use the word elimination diet at the very end of this description because, today a lot of people are on elimination diets, and that's fine. And maybe it's good, maybe it's not for them. But for us, it was 2 years worth of mass data sets. And we came out with 21 foods, raw ingredients of foods that I could eat. So, for instance, today, the only foods I eat, I'm not going to name all 21 because I always fail to remember all of them, but very pure reverse osmosis or spring water, Himalayan salt, zucchini squash, green beans, russet potatoes. And there's complexity here that this is where people start laughing. But I can't have a yellow potato. I can have a russet potato. I can have, a this whatever. Green beans. If I eat a green bean that was grown in a vine sort of variety, so it grew upwards instead of out, I get sick, really sick, like 2 weeks long of a flu sort of sick. But if I eat a green bean that was grown in a bush, so bush variety, I don't get sick. And it's when I say 2 years worth of intense data collection, that's what this was. And so for the past, I think it's been 6 years now, the only food I've ever consumed, it's only the food that I prepare. And so we obtain raw ingredients from sources that we know and trust, probably our gardens and our pastures, which is one of the reasons we farm at such a large scale. And we take that food, and Morgan or myself cooks it. My sister hasn't cooked me a meal in, whatever, 5, 6, 7 years. My mom hasn't cooked me a meal. My friends haven't cooked me a meal. No one has cooked me a meal but my hands and Morgan's. And through this intense dedication to the ingredients, the connection to those food items, you know, I've seriously found health. What worked for me is finding where the peace was. When I eat these foods, I feel peaceful. And when I eat these foods, I don't. And so I don't eat those foods. And I eat these foods. And this gets a little bit more into philosophy, less into science, but I really believe that when you start to connect with your local place and the biologics of that place, and you start to partner with the life in producing greater symbiosis, and you look at your food as your healing partner, you gain a sort of self mastery that is impossible any other way. I mean, for instance, what does a potato taste like? I mean, no, seriously, take out the oils, the salts, the herbs, the spices, maybe the ketchup that you like to dip your french fries into, and try to answer this question. What does a potato taste like? I'm asking about the essence of the thing in its raw state. Do you know a potato, or do you know the facade, right, of a french fry? It's not just a self mastery of your own body, your own health, your own soul, but the life and the bodies of those around you. You start to see life for what it is, living, right? And in this way of understanding, there's more than beauty, there's more than health, there's connection. And that's all the health we need. Okay, so enough philosophy. Let's dive into a quick story and then jump into something else. A couple years ago, uh, my wife, myself, my brother, and his wife were out in Colorado. We were hiking 14ers and other mountains and things. And not just do I have the complete ability to do that work, but we were at about, I don't know what it was, maybe 11,000 feet above sea level. We were just breaking the tree line in the Colorado Rockies, and none of us, well, everybody else in the group didn't have enough energy to keep going, and we only had about an hour to get back to the gondola down at 8,000 feet to take us back to our where we started, where our car was. And so we had a long hike down the mountain to do in about an hour. We were running very late, but I wanted to get to the top. The top was about 12,000 feet, this particular hike we were doing. And I looked at them and I said, listen, if I run to the top, take a picture, and run back down in 30 minutes, would you wait for me? And they said, okay, but like, we're going to start walking back. So like, you better hurry. And I had the enough energy. Half of it was adrenaline because I really wanted to get to the top. But I had the energy to do it. I ran to the top, about 1,000 vertical feet, asked this individual, this lady who was just kind of camping up there with some, prayer flags and the like, to take a quick picture of me. And then I ran downhill. And, we did it. We made it back to the gondola. But afterwards, my wife and my brother and his wife, they looked at me and they said, hey, a number of people passed us on their way down when you were gone, running up the mountain. They asked who that crazy redhead with long hair running up this mountain was and if we knew him. And and we said we didn't. We didn't. He's crazy. Nobody knows who this guy is. But I had enough energy to do that. And and that really is the abundance, right? We talk about regenerative agriculture, we talk about holistic management, we talk about food, raise, and regenerating in healthy environments, and that's fine. Um, but the story of my regeneration is the story of the regeneration of my ecology. And when I say my ecology, it's the ecology of my place. It's the regeneration of my connection to this living and abundant and emerging environment that doesn't only just support itself, but supports the life of everything else that's with it. And that's symbiosis. And we talk about, health and carbon sequestration and building the water carrying and the water cycling capacity of our land bases, and that's fine, but peace. We, on our farm between Morgan and I and with our kids, we talk about the peace that exists in regenerative environments, be that a human environment inside of our bodies that, produces health, or, a natural environment like the soil and healthy food webs. But it is peace. And peace doesn't mean, if I can make this quick comment, that there's no death, right? Peace doesn't mean that. I don't mean we're laying in hammocks, reading books under palm trees at the side of the ocean. Peace to me does not mean those things. Peace, from a regenerative perspective, means balance in a very traditional Chinese medical sense. It implies balance, yin and yang, constantly working around each other to create peace, abundance, health, balance. It takes death, it takes life, it takes regrowth. And that is regeneration. And I guess maybe poorly said, but that is my regenerative story.
Daniel, few people have felt the power of regenerative agriculture as fully as you have. Your story is really inspiring to me, and you're a hero, and you are also a massive nerd. I don't
Yes,
think
yes, yes.
anyone else, it took you being where you were in your predicament with your skill sets to commit to 2 years of journaling and documentation, building that data set. Um, Few people could have done that. And thank goodness you did, because you are now, like I said, a prophet of fertility for the environment, for um, your community. It's an inspiration.
Aw, thanks, Jesse. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. It is true, though. I definitely am a massive nerd. In college, I tutored Calc 3 and aced my way through most math classes. I won coding competitions. I mean, I was a part of the math club, which my wife still makes fun of me for. And I also was a history major and published a nearly 200-page dissertation on the early American West, focused on Daniel Boone and his relationship with the indigenous peoples of Kankakee and Southern Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia regions of the early United States. So when we started visualizing a future in the regenerative movement and farming in general, we attacked the nerd side of the thing with the same vigor and energy as we did with everything else in our lives. When we found every single book, every podcast, every YouTube video, subscribe to every bit of content you could possibly imagine, and just absolutely immersed ourselves in the philosophy and practice of regeneration, farming, animal husbandry, soil health, and the like. And it does help that my wife is a biologist and understands those things better than I do. But we attacked learning from a position of nerdhood, I guess you would say. And the reason is I believe in making accurate decisions based off of deep observation. Um, and that's the case. But in order for me to get off that chair, in order for me to raise those chickens in the backyard, I read every chicken book you could possibly imagine. I read them all. I mean, I probably didn't read them all, but I read 99% of them because I wanted to know what everybody thought, and I wanted to compare and contrast all the different raising methodologies and pick the one that I believed was most abundant, most peaceful, and that's how we approached farming.
So, Daniel, before we started this interview, I could hear in your voice that you were nervous about doing this today, and you said you were hesitant to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible story of perseverance and um, overcoming a unique and mysterious and daunting challenge, and yet you don't like telling it.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a very decent point. I don't like talking about myself, and even when I stand in front of folks telling my story, I don't enjoy it. But I think it has to do with language, and not feeling comfortable with the language that I'm using to tell the story. And this could be a fault of my own, but I think this fault is also the fault of Western civilization. And let me define or better explain what I mean there. Western civilization has been built on the linguistic back of Latin, derived languages that dominate their grammar with nouns instead of verbs. So, for instance, there's more nouns in the English language than there are verbs. That said, as I mentioned earlier, I wrote that larger dissertation on indigenous wisdom of the early American West. But in the study of that wisdom, you have to study the language. And when you peel back the etymology of indigenous, especially Northeastern indigenous languages, you see that this reality is flipped. There's more verbs than nouns, and we can spend, an entire podcast talking about this. And for the sake of time, let's skip it. But the point here is to understand the difference of language, but what that does to your culture and how you perceive the world around you. But there's another important distinction to make, and it's that Latin based languages see its grammar as either masculine or feminine. But take, for instance, the Potawatomi language, which is Central Algonquin language of the Northeast. They don't have this differentiation. They don't see their language as either masculine or feminine. Instead, they see language as either animate or not animate, or in other words, living or not living. And so when they look at what Latin-based languages would, consider things, rocks, dirt, earthworms, trees, they don't see masculine or feminine. They see living and non-living, and therefore they don't say that something is a tree. They say someone is a tree, right? There's personhood in life. There's a human and there's a tree. Both are living, both are animate, and therefore they are connected. All life is connected. And when you perceive life through the grammar of animacy, this is not my terminology. This was the terminology of the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. If you've never read that book, read it, then read it again. But she classified this language, this connection to place through your grammar as a language, the grammar of animacy. And this grammar produces connection that is much deeper than sight, much deeper than sound. It's connection at the level in which we understand communication and community. And that makes all the difference. Bringing this all back home, what I'm trying to say is I don't know if I have this language. I don't know if regeneration is complete, in my story. I don't know where my story goes tomorrow, and I still get sick. I still accidentally screw up, or one of the kids drops an apple, which I cannot have in my plate, and it taints the rest of my food, and I get sick for a period of time. And so my regeneration is cyclic, right? And my language is incomplete. And so, on top of not wanting to talk about myself, I don't even know how to start. What became very obvious to me in the very beginning of farming, even the backyard chickens, was that civilization as a historical force, and again, my background in history helped me get to this point. It's really a meat grinder. I mean, when you look at the rise of civilization, you look at the rise of the grinding, large scale grinding of meat, right? The wholesale destruction of species and ecosystems. That's something that the human species has to deal with. Um, we have to look back at our history and deal with this, and that's part of the regenerative agriculture movement is looking back and looking forward and saying, okay, in order to thrive here on planet Earth, us earthlings need to work within the natural bounties and systems of Earth. We talk a lot about CAFOs today, commercial cattle farms and degrading environments, erosion, desertification, other things. But let's talk for a moment about historical land use, or rather misuse. At the beginning of the 1800s, it's believed that the Great Plains contained between 25 and 30 million bison. By 1886-87, after the westward push of the wonderful American citizens, that 25 to 30 million had been reduced to what is believed today to be about 1,000. So in a period of about 80 years, we went from 25 to 30 million to 1,000. Let's get off of bison for a moment. Let's talk about pronghorn. So these are antelope-like deer. Again, at the beginning of the 1800s, rough numbers, but about 15 million, we believe, occupied the Great Plains. 1899, the United States Bureau of Biological Survey wanted to know how many pronghorns still existed in that same geographic area, the Great Plains. 32 was all that we could find. We brought it from 15 million to 32. And the reason I bring up these numbers, because it may feel out of place, is to set the narrative, to set the context of human civilization in the 21st century. How do humans live and occupy abundant ecosystems so that they thereby could also live abundantly and healthy and peaceful lives? Going back to my story, right? Um, we have decided as a farm, when we farm, we want to farm natural ecosystems. This is our context. We want to put cows in systems where cows would want to be, even if humans didn't create that system. And we want to do the same for all of the other species on our farm. And so, right now we have a veggie CSA on our farm, but all the veggies are either wild foraged, which we give away as gifts. They're nature's gifts to us, so it's our gift to our customers. And also, two, they're ancient perennial varieties. So, for instance, groundnut. Groundnut is a native, it's really only one of the native, it's really, I should say, one of the only vegetables that the Native Americans of the southeastern United States cultivated and propagated. But it's a potato tasting, root tuber that, grows. Anyways, the point is what we wanted to create was natural environments. I didn't want to grow tomatoes. That wasn't fun for me. That's not peaceful for me. I wanted to grow groundnut and all sorts of other species like Jerusalem artichoke, which are also called sunchokes. Bring that over to animal agriculture, and our farm is run by three fundamental tenets. The first tenet is that we don't castrate any of our animals. We think that a boy is born on our farm, that it should continue to be a boy in the true sense of what nature understands a boy to be, with all of its hormones intact. And so when you look at our herds and flocks, or, our whatever pig groups are called, you see boars, you see bulls, and you see rams. And what this does, outside of just keeping the hormone systems of our animals intact, it also naturalizes our breeding calendars, right? We've all heard regenerative pioneers and authors in our movement say, "Oh, we breed in the spring because the deer breed in the spring." The issue is we've never really asked a cow, a sheep, a goat, or a pig when they want to breed, actually when they want to breed, and then give them the beautiful and abundant ecosystem in which to tell us. So, for instance, wild animals breed according to the seasons. We don't understand those seasons, but they understand the cues of seasonal sunlight, weather patterns, nutrition far better than we do, right? We say the cow is the best cow. I, a human being, am a horrible cow, right? And so, if these wisdoms, these innate wisdoms in these animals are left unified and left unbroken, or in this case, unbanded, right? The epigenetics will continue to rewild to the local biome, right? Their genetics will adapt to the climatic pressures present in our local biome, and their natural instincts will effectively retune to this natural environment, and this is their cycle. Tenet number two is very easy to describe and to understand, is that we don't separate any of our animals. We always run one herd, one flock, one sounder, or, one whatever. So when you walk out into the field, all of our bulls are with all of our cows, who are with all of our calves, who are with all of our heifers. And the same thing goes through all of our, different tools we have on the farm, the different systems, the different animal species. And so when we talk about, as regenerative practitioners, creating herd effect in our pastures, well, it's hard to do unless you have a herd. And so how do you keep this herd, this family unit, this genetic and epigenetic unit acting like you want it to, as a herd, as one unit, when, you separate them? When you combine and you break up, and you combine and you separate, right? Right? That's not a definition of a herd. That's the definition of a dysfunctional community. The third tenet is somewhat identical to the second, but it's that we don't wean any of our animals. I've already said we don't separate them. We don't have a steer herd and a pregnant cow herd and a yearling heifer herd and a bull herd. We don't have that. But we also don't wean our animals. So when an animal is born on the farm, we want to keep that family unit intact. Not only for ethical reasons, right? I don't care to take a daughter away from its mother, but also for safety issues and epigenetic issues and the health of the greater herd. And so this is our context. These are the tenets that come out of the future that we want to create, a future that is less of a farm and more of a rewilded ecosystem. We say we're not regenerative farmers, but emergent conservationists. That is our focus, and that is our context. We push for ecosystem and species emergence, self-organization, co-creation, adaptive genomics, developmental plasticity. These are all words that describe naturally functioning ecosystems with abundance that we can't even fathom. And as Charles Eisenstein says in his book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, is the title. It's a great book. What he claims is that if Newton is right, if Isaac Newton is right, and that objects in motion are only in motion because they're set in motion, then the abundance of that motion, right, is indicative and is also limited by, right, the control we have over that force. Lose the control, and you gain even greater abundance, right? When you lose control, you break the limits. And that's what we're trying to do on our farm. That's what we're focused on.
Well, I just want to make a point on that. One of the biggest shifts in my thinking that occurred when I started shepherding was the shift from focusing on an individual animal to focusing on the flock. When I came into this, I thought, I'm going to raise very healthy individual sheep. That was my goal, really healthy, natural sheep as individuals. To seeing my goal is to create a flock because the flock became the unit in my thinking. And I think that what happened in Western culture is we became obsessed with the individual and not the whole system. And I mean that are you peeing?
I can't hold it no more!
Daniel!
It's happening.
Well, I'm not even going to finish my point. Daniel, I'm going to read you a quote when you're done with your tinkle. There's a mute button on the screen. You could have pressed that.
I thought about pressing it, but then I thought you might be that I was mute. But I didn't want you to, pause what you were saying because it was so good.
All right, this goes back to our conversation about ethics. All right, and it's kind of a devil's advocate question. But I'm going to read you a quote from Robert Greene Ingersoll. In nature, there are neither rewards nor punishments, there are consequences. Now, that seems to me, I take that to mean ethics don't exist in nature. So, if ethics don't exist in nature, are we artificially inserting ethics onto a system where it doesn't exist? And so, I agree with you that it is incumbent upon us as humans to reduce the amount of suffering on the life that we require for food as much as we can.
I'll address that quote and these thoughts with more thoughts. That's all these are. First, a clarification. When I use the word ethic, I'm really stealing it from Otto Leopold in his 1940s and 50s essays and in his book, The St. Kenny Almanac, where he talks about a land ethic, right? Which is simply in my reading of that work, and if you haven't read that work, I would encourage you deeply to look at Aldo Leopold and especially the St. County Almanac. I would start there, but it's really about caring about people and then the land, and then strengthening the relationship between them. So just like you wouldn't take human life without considering the consequences, right? So probably in most every case you wouldn't do it. You shouldn't take other life without considering the consequences, right? All life is life, and that is the ethic that I'm describing. I think it's really important. This ethic has driven me to consider a carrot and the cow as a very similar thing, and in fact, probably the same thing. We talked earlier of grammar, and the difference that occurs when you say someone is in my hair versus something is in your hair. If you see the leaf as a someone, that it has personhood, it has quality in and of itself, that it communicates in its own way to what it needs to communicate with. That leaf, in this instance being a tree, and talking about the fungal network that, we're only beginning to understand trees communicating with other trees and other things, your life changes. Your life has to change, right? These aren't bugs as species that exist that humans need to destroy. They're persons. They're not humans. We don't have to get into that debate. I'm not saying everything is a human, but humans are a person. Bugs are persons. Rocks are persons. Trees are persons. Everything has personhood because everything else has life. And when you look at this equation, you see a carrot and a cow is a similar thing. And that's why when people ask me about vegetarianism, and if I've ever run into an ethical vegetarian that I had debated with or had confrontation with, the answer is no. No, I agree with vegetarians more than I probably agree with carnivores. And in the sense that most of the vegetarians that I know care so deeply about a cow that I can't imagine eating it. And I completely agree with them. But I don't see the carrot and the cow as something different from each other. They're both living organisms that both communicate with other life forms in ways that they find possible, right? The carrot communicates with the soil, not in any sort of human way. They don't have mouths and they don't have brains, and that we understand they have mouths and brains, but they still communicate, they still interact, they still form symbiotic relationships with the soil that produce a very nutrient rich, orange, wonderful root that humans then can then enjoy, or rabbits, or any other groundhog, or anything else you find in the garden eating your carrots. And so ethics to me is that it's the understanding that all life has purpose, and that you'll never chop down a tree without considering why you're chopping down a tree. For instance, Otto Leopold said there's many definitions of conservation, and this is a paraphrase. I wish I can quote this. It's probably something I should memorize to its exact words, because Aldo was just a brilliant writer, and the way he formed his thoughts is just punishing, to say the least. But he writes that he's seen many different forms and definitions of conservationism. But the true definition of conservation is not wielding an axe. It's not conservation is simply not chopping down a tree, but what the thing holding the axe is thinking about. And so conservation isn't not falling a tree. Conservation is what you're thinking about in your head while chopping the tree down, or while considering whether you should chop the tree down or not. That's what I'm classifying and defining as ethics. It's a healthy relationship between all life.
Some of the greatest um, arguments I've heard, and um, against industrial vegetable production, are if you do in fact value all life as sacred, from leaf to beetle to bovine, then under that framework, spraying poison into thousands of acres to grow row vegetables is, you know, on a numbers scale, destroying millions, if not billions, more lives than taking one cow out of a field.
All I have is questions. Don't think that I have answers, because I don't. I say what I'm about to say with complete humility, but take what you said a step further. Let's talk about compost. Certified organic veggie production requires compost. Compost, in order to be certified organic, has to get to a certain internal temperature that kills all life, right? Microbes, worms, fungi. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. And so if you see protozoa as life, in as much as, or with the same degree that you see bovine, cattle, sheep, pigs, whatever, humans as life, if you hold protozoa as life and humans as life or cattle as life, then certified organic compost is death. At numbers in the billions in one shovelful.
Mm-hmm. But that's because we're not impartial. We're taking the side of the lettuce that we've planted, not the bunnies that need it, right? So in that relationship, we view the rabbits as a pest or a nuisance because we're taking the side of the carrot, or they're taking the side of the lettuce. Now, in your own microbiome, you can't take sides. There's a war going on there all the time that our human species depends on existing. If there's not a war going on in your belly, then you're sick. It is, and it's the same on the surface of the earth. If there's not death, life, decay, there's no regrowth, and there's no health, and there's no abundance. So I think one of the biggest paradigm shifts in this whole regenerative movement is learning to not take sides in these natural conflicts. And that once you do that, you think that's not an invasive species. That's here for a reason. That's not a a pest. That's here for a reason. Everything is returning to balance. It is returning to a more natural state of being. And because we take sides on in these conflicts, we view it as our duty to push things out or to control things or to insert things into the ecosystem. And in cases where we have removed things as a human species, like you're saying with the bison, I think it's our duty to restore that balance because we're the only force on the planet that can.
Which is our power. And I think all life has particular power in its own context. Humans can't stop hillsides from eroding. Trees and grasses can do that. And so when you look at the different contexts of power, you see that every life form on this earth has its own power and its own context. But the power of humans, right? And this goes back to what Alan Savory said in the beginning, and in the forming of holistic management. Humans have the ability to manage. Humans have the ability to pool tools from here and put them there to restore ecosystem function. A cow can't look at a sheep and say, no, you graze over there. And then tomorrow, based upon my dictates, I want you to move and graze over there. Cows don't have that ability. Humans have that ability. In environments that we've degraded, the beauty of regenerative agriculture and the hope that got me out of that chair, going back to my story and going back to the beginning of this conversation, the hope that humans have is in that we can destroy, we can heal, right? In that we have taken the bison, we can bring the bison back with ethics. And people can clash me, professors of ethics and universities can say I'm using the word wrong. That's fine. I'm using it as Aldo Leopold used it. And that is when humans and the environment meet, the land ethic is the symbiotic relationship that brings abundance from that interaction. And by the way, this isn't all life and death. Well, I guess you can extrapolate what I'm about to say as still life and death, but when we teach courses on more of a permaculture scale, if you're harvesting, nuts to replant them, if you take a walnut and you want to, propagate that walnut by you take a walnut tree and you want to propagate the walnut tree by planting its seed, which is its nut, in the soil, we always say to plant two or three, one for yourself, right? One for the squirrel, and one for, whatever you don't know that occurs in your ecosystem when you're gone. Don't plant one and then kill the squirrel when it takes it. Plant one for the squirrel. You as a human have the ability to do this. And there's a lot of ways you can take that, into veggie agriculture, into animal-based regenerative agriculture, and build systems that are abundant, that are actually abundant for all life forms within those systems. Yes, death occurs, but life comes out of death. Only death that brings new life is worth the death. That's something you have to consider, especially as farmers who deal with a lot of death.
You've been in regenerative agriculture in the regenerative movement for a while. I've been in the regenerative agriculture and larger movement for a while. Others, many others, obviously have been in it much far longer than we have been. And obviously, indigenous peoples around the world have been in it since the beginning of time. But I feel collective consciousness is moving in this direction, and the idea that human impact on the planet can only be negative is starting to change. And I think that the work you're doing and the story you're telling are, and stories like it, are a big part of people waking up to the idea that human impact on the planet, A, doesn't have to be negative, and therefore it doesn't have to be necessarily reduced. So much of the environmental um, environmentalist dogma is to reduce your impact on the planet. Which, if your impact is negative, you should. We all should in those ways. But the impact does not have to be negative. It can be incredibly positive. And in those ways, we need to, in fact, increase human impact on the planet. And I think that idea getting out there is causing this regenerative movement to gain steam, and the bandwagon is getting bigger and bigger. And I hope it keeps going and gets to be a default, not a niche movement for human activity. Um, and I think that the work you're doing, Daniel, will very soon eclipse the the story you have to tell. So if I say to you, Daniel, what's your story? There's one story that pops to your head because it was defining for you. It changed your life and it hurts. But I think in 10 years, when we say, Daniel, what's your story? It's going to be one of empowerment, regeneration, and it will no longer be the one
Mm,
that hurts you.
yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, as we're concluding this, let me just say a couple things that one offer, a proper, maybe more hopeful conclusion based upon the tone, of what you just said, but also two, just maybe clarify some other things. Why we farm. The original reason why we farmed, is obviously my health and my health journey, or really my lack of health and desire for health. Um, but it has grown and transfigured into something so much more and so much bigger than me. Um, you know, we say that we started farming because of we wanted to save my life. and we're continuing farming because we have so many more lives to save. When I have two young kids and a third one on the way, and when I look at them, I look at Elowen, our 2-year-old daughter, in her face, and there's hope there. There's connection there that I believe is possible for not just her or her local system, but for everybody. I mean, there the peace, the health, the abundance that is formed from a land ethic, from the connection, the symbiotic connection between man and earth, isn't just relative to the farmers, but to the community at large. And that's why the Rabinia Institute it was formed. Again, just trying to redefine what a farm is. It's not a place where cowboys move cows. It's a place where cows and cowboys exist to create a better future. That's a farm. And instead of cowboys or cows, you could say gardeners and porch gardeners. I mean, it doesn't matter the size or the species. All life is life, like we talked about. And so, although we started farming for my life, we really farm for theirs being our kids, theirs being, our community. In addition to that, I want to make it somewhat decently clear. I think, in addition to that, one thing I wanted to encourage, our listener and the greater regenerative movement with is the understanding of humility. We've talked in this about my story, which is, getting out of the chair. I think that's a fine way of summarizing it. There's action there. We're talking about regeneration, right? That implies action. I've talked about active health versus passive health. But really the foundation of all of this, of the regenerative movement, is deep humility. Right? It's understanding that nature has existed long before man. And although man has really screwed it up, and although man can really help heal nature, man is just one part of it. Man being humankind, of course. Um, and when you realize that you're just part of nature, that the tree is a person in as much as a human is a person, but a tree is distinct from a human in its context and its power and in its mission within the greater system in which it interacts, you realize that you really need to act with deep humility. That when you look at a cow, you realize that the cow is a better cow than a human is. And that's a really good thing. It's a really good thing. And that, the way you manage your sheep, Jesse, in Vermont is very different from the way I manage my sheep here in Virginia, because Virginia is not Vermont. And I'm not as good as a shepherdess as you are. And so, things are just different. And that's beautiful. Difference is beautiful.